Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, to keep in line with what I do for all of my Survivor retrospectives, around time the 20th anniversary of the finale of Australian Survivor 2002, I will be doing a player ranking for that season. So again, we will be ranking all 16 players from Australian Survivor 2002. I know this is a list that everyone has been waiting for. And this will be based around how they played on this individual season, not on my assessment of them as players in the grand scheme of things. And let's just jump right into it at number 16. At number 16, the worst player from Australian Survivor 2002 is, it's Lucinda, who is the first boot on the season, who really just did nothing on the season. She was one of the older members of the tribe. She was looked at as the physically weakest on the tribe and did tell the tribe to vote her out because of that, and then proceeded to actually vote for herself because in Australian Survivor, at least at this point, there was no rule against it, so she literally votes herself out. It was an 8-0 vote. The one positive for her game is the fact that it seemed like people liked her. Even though she does get taken out unanimously here, again, she was well liked, but it wasn't enough to keep her around, and she voted herself out, and she told people to vote her out, so she's at the bottom here at number 16. At number 15, the other person that was voted out at the first tribal that they attended, we do have Jeff, the only person voted out pre-merge from the Tapara tribe, and I did consider putting him higher because by the time he goes home, he does have two people that want to keep him around in Shona and Katie, who do vote to keep him, but realistically, I feel like he played everything else so poorly. He was already in a bad spot considering he was the oldest person on the tribe and one of the physically weakest people there. He was also injured. So again, naturally, he wasn't set up for this game anyway, but he was also really abrasive and showed a lot of bad sportsmanship that pissed off the other tribe and also pissed off his own tribe with how it made their tribe come off to the other tribe. And I do think that played a major factor in why the votes ended up actually landing on him, because again, it was close between him and Jane. He does get voted out in a 5-3 vote. Again, it is relatively close there, but I do think that was pretty much the death sentence for his game, which was actively bad gameplay. But because he had a couple people that did want to keep him around, I did put him above Lucinda, and he is here at number 15. Now number 14, another early boot on the season. Here we do have the second boot of the season. We have Tim. Now obviously he was voted out at the second tribal council immediately after Lucinda, someone who essentially quit the game and told people to vote her out. Tim is someone that is a bit interesting because there were some people that, again, wanted to keep him around. David didn't want to vote him out. Craig didn't want to vote him out. But he still does go home with the majority of the votes when the tribe openly talked about not strategizing and just voting on their gut. And he was just a clear person to go home here, him being the oldest person on the tribe. To be honest, I don't think he does that much wrong on this season. He does seem to be somewhat capable as a player. Again, obviously everyone on this season, or at least the majority of players on the season, are not really thinking about the game in the same way that you would on a modern season. But I think in comparison to Jeff, I think he is clearly a better player than Jeff. I think he was more respected by his own tribe than Jeff was, and at least survives the single tribal. But it's also someone that was just destined to never really do well, despite the fact that he was a physical asset. He didn't do bad in challenges. The host actually even scolds them for voting him out, saying that he would have helped him in the next immunity challenge, which is humorous. But really, there's nothing that negative and nothing that positive to say about Tim, and considering he is still the second boot, I didn't really feel like I could put him much higher than number 14 here. Now, number 13 is the next boot after that, and spoiler alert, this might be a trend for the next couple people we're going to be talking about, but at number 13 we do have David. David is interesting because I remember David pretty fondly coming into my rewatch. He was one of the more notable figures of the pre-merge to me, and I kind of remembered him being one of the hardest players on the cast, and he is probably, but he doesn't play well. He is sick right off the bat and isn't able to help his tribe in that aspect. I think he kind of gets helped out by the fact that Lucinda performs so badly and pretty much, again, quits the game. But even at the second vote, after he recovers and everything, he's still someone that is talked about as being taken out, and Craig does vote for him, only for him to then be taken out the very next tribal. Now, I will say that the one major positive for me is that you could definitely tell he had an awareness of the strategy of the game. He realized during his boot round that he's very much on the bottom, and he tries to get Deb and Karen to go on his side to flip the game against Sylvan, Naomi, and Craig, but isn't successful in doing so. But again, that strategic thought is definitely better than most other people from this cast in terms of the strategy of the game. But realistically, I feel like socially he was not really all there. I think it was pretty clear that some people just did not get along with him. And the way that he handles getting that one vote that he got from Craig at the second tribal council seemed to turn some people off against him as well. So really for me, I just can't support putting David much higher on the list. He's here at number 13. Now number 12, spoiler alert, the next boot from the Kadena tribe, we do have Deborah, who was there. I mean, I think Deborah's a very tough one to assess because even though she gets a good amount of content on the show, I don't really fully get her position in the game. Like the way that it's shown is that she is on the bottom, like with David and Karen, but it doesn't really make sense based on how the game plays out. Like we do see at her boot round, like she does go home next after David in a 3-2 vote, but in a 3-2 vote where Sylvan sides with her and Karen is voting with Naomi and Craig, which is never explained on the show. Now Deb did get sick and that definitely played a factor into why she ends up going home. But outside that, I really don't get the dynamics of why she actually ends up going home when she does. Though it does seem like she was outside of the core power structure really the entire way, where again, it does seem like Naomi, Sylvan, and Craig were essentially the cool kids that were together, and Karen eventually joined them, and at that point Deb was just on the bottom. I also don't love that Deb completely outed David after he tries to pull her into his alliance, which I do think also worsened her position moving forward. So again, not a great game, but she does outlast David, and I guess that's enough to put her higher than him here at number 12. Now number 11, and we are wrapping up the pre-merge here with the penultimate boot before the merge, and that is Sylvan. Now, I don't know how to assess Sylvan's game because, we do hear multiple times that he's very close to Naomi, that he has an alliance with Craig and Naomi, and they're the main power structure. But then the game doesn't really play out that way, though. Again, he votes with Deborah on the vote that she ends up going home. He ends up getting voted out immediately afterwards. And now the show does show him a lot as being really just out of it. It very much felt like the conditions were tough on him to where he kind of zoned out of the game by episode 4 or so, and maybe that is what ruined his relationships and caused him to be voted out. But again, I don't fully know. It's not really explained on the show. Because again, he is in the majority early on. He is seemingly well liked early on in the game, but then everything just goes downhill for him to where again, he's on the outs during the Deb vote, and then he immediately gets voted out afterwards. So I don't know if Karen made an alliance to keep herself in the game with the other two, or by that point was he just screw it, I want to go home, because very clearly he was not super into the game to begin with. I don't know. But again, the fact that he was at least in the core power structure at one point is better than the other 5 people we've talked about who were never in the core power structure. So whatever, he's here number 11, I guess. Now number 10, we're on to the players that made the merge. And at number 10 is someone that I really thought about putting higher, because I do think there are certain elements of his game that would put him higher, but he still clearly lacks something within the game. So at number 10, we do have Lance. Now, Lance was the second boot off of the Tapira tribe, essentially. He does get 7th place. He gets pretty far into the game, but that's because Tapira never goes to tribal after the Jeff vote, and we have a straight pagonging after a merge. So really, Lance is taken out at the very next opportunity, which is a pretty bad sign for his overall game. Mind you, he does get somewhat unlucky in the fact that Joel was actually the target coming into that round, and Joel wins immunity, which causes Lance to be the target. And I will say also that the one major positive about Lance is that a lot of people really liked Lance out there. You can definitely see how many people were so disappointed that Joel won immunity because it meant that they had to vote out Lance, which I think is, again, indicative of Lance's social play at least. But it just seemed like strategically he had nothing going on. He was obviously being constantly told that there were alliances and that he wasn't part of them, with Craig just straight up outlining the majority alliance, and Lance just didn't believe it and gets taken out immediately after Craig. He did, again, seem to have a pretty close relationship with Joel. He did seem to build bonds with, Sophie and Rob while out there, and, they didn't want to vote him out, but they still did. And he clearly just was completely aloof on the strategic elements of this game, and with him also being the second boot from his group, I just decided there's not much positive here to really associate his game with, so he does end up landing here at number 10. Now at number 9, and at number 9, we're starting the streak of the final Kadena players who all went out back to back to back after the merge. At number 9, the worst of the 3 to me is Karen. Now, Karen's an interesting one because I actually think Karen is probably a better player than what we were shown on the show. Because the thing is, like, early on, again, like, when David is trying to put together the minority, he perceives Karen to be on the bottom. However, in reality, Karen, again, was part of the majority by the time of the Deb vote, where despite her being looked at as a physical weakness throughout the entire pre-merge, she gets through 5 tribals there. Like, that is pretty impressive for someone that is perceived as weak. And again, she does vote out Deb, is in the majority during that. She does vote out Sylvan immediately afterwards. Like, she really votes correctly every single time up until the merge. And then at the merge, like, she does get unlucky that Craig wins immunity to where, again, it's either her or Naomi. And I assume they perceived her as a bigger threat than Naomi. But then again, I also feel like Naomi was probably just better socially than Karen, which is the reason why Karen is lower than Naomi on the list. But still, I mean, like, I don't think Karen played particularly poorly. Yeah, I mean, like, she survived quite a bit despite being perceived as being a weakling, and probably would have had a decent chance of making it to the end had her tribe came into the merge with the majority, though I feel like she still probably struggles winning at the end, and due to her just not being as good socially as really either of the other 2 people that made it as far as she did, I did feel like she had to stay here at number 9. Now number 8, we're moving on to the penultimate Kadena member, which might be a little bit of a surprise if anyone actually cares, and that person is Craig. Now, Craig was the last Kadena member standing and was someone that had a lot of respect from a lot of the players that were out there, to where if I do feel like if he got to the very end, I think he probably wins. However, I feel like Craig's overall game is very rocky. I mean, really, I feel like Craig is kind of like the Greg Buis of Australian Survivor. Again, not as fun as of a character. I mean, like, Greg Buis is obviously a fantastic character, while Craig's just kind of okay. But I think in terms of the gameplay, I think they are pretty similar. Where very early on, like, Craig, despite being clearly part of the majority, is like kind of just going on his own, like voting for David during the Tim vote for like no real reason, which ends up pissing off David moving forward. He is seemingly a bit all over the place in terms of his relationships on the tribe. Again, like, it's portrayed as he's close to Sylvan, then like he eventually votes out Sylvan before the merge, despite them seemingly be very, very close. At the merge, I mean, he wins the first 2 immunity challenges, and that's the only reason he gets to 8th place. If it wasn't for that, he would have been the first boot from the merge. He does play very haphazardly. I mean, kind of reminded me of Boston Rob from Marquesas, where he spends a lot of his time in the post-merge really just going from person to person, telling them that there's an alliance around, they're outside the majority, you need to flip to my side. Again, does it very sloppily to where like everyone knows exactly what he's doing. And while he does make some progress with Joel in particular, like Joel ends up going back to Katie and Rob and ends up getting flipped back anyway. And because that, there does become a bit of an anti-Craig sentiment while out there, due to how hard he is playing at this point. Then again, what else is he going to do? But that's not particularly great. Again, I don't think it really matters at the end of the day, as I think if he made it to the end, I think he was still winning a jury vote. And no matter what, he was going to need to win out from that point anyway. But yeah, I do think he does overall play that section of the game pretty sloppily. However, I will also say that I think he does some good work here and there. I mean, again, like for the majority of the pre-merge, he is in the majority. Again, outside of that Tim vote, he is clearly part of the main power structure and is able to survive 5 tribals there. Again, he does play very aggressively once he gets to merge. Like, while it is very sloppy gameplay, again, like for this time in Survivor, it's nice to see someone try that hard. And then he also builds a very strong bond with Shona, to where Shona wants to keep Craig around and does fight to keep him around. And even though that is unsuccessful, I mean, for him to get someone that is very high on the pecking order to try to keep him around, I do think is also impressive gameplay from him. But again, at the end of the day, his gameplay is so sloppy that I do struggle with putting him any higher than number 8 here. Now, number 7, the top Kadena member for me is a bit of a surprise. I was not expecting this coming into the rewatch, but I think when rewatching the season, I was a bit more impressed with this person's gameplay. Again, quote unquote gameplay, because this is Australian Survivor 2002. But at number 7, we do have Naomi. And Naomi is, to me, the person that was very clearly in the middle of the original Kadena tribe. Again, like she's the person that voted in the majority the entire time, all 5 tribals, while never being a target during any of those 5 tribals, and also just seemingly being in the middle the entire way. Like the only time she actually gets a vote is in the penultimate tribal before the merge, where Sylvan goes home, but Sylvan explicitly says that his vote doesn't matter at that point, and he's just voting for her because he hasn't voted for her before. I mean, we do see her being pretty close to Sylvan at points, being pretty close to Craig. And by the end, you would assume she's pretty close to Karen as well. And she seems to be in a pretty good spot. Again, survives 5 tribals there, gets to the merge where they decide to keep her over Karen, which I think probably due to her social relationships. As we do see in the next round where she does eventually go home, they do consider keeping her around. Like, they do want to keep her around because they do genuinely like her. And again, while the move never happens, for them to actually be considering keeping her around just because they naturally like her, I think is a pretty good indication of how good she was socially while out there. And considering, again, she would have been the last Kadena standing if Craig hadn't won immunity, and did also seem to be better positioned throughout really the majority of the game than Craig or Karen. For me, I think Naomi is very clearly the top Kadena member for me. She's here at number 7. Now, number 6, we're on to the final 6. And at 6, we do have the person who came in 6. We have Jane. And my opinion, Jane's game went up a little bit during this rewatch as well. Again, very minorly, but I think Jane is someone that, despite her not being well respected while out there, I feel like a lot of that came from her age. Again, she is 18 years old, very clearly comes off as the youngest. She did have some poor reads in the game at points where she talks about how she thinks she's respected by everyone when we get confessionals about people straight up talking about not respecting her. But I think if we're looking at the game from a strict positioning standpoint, I think she did all right. Like, she was never in a position to make it deep into the game. I think that's obviously a major flaw, is that very rarely does she make past like final 5, final 4. But she did seem to make good social bonds with people like Sophie, to where Sophie actively tries to keep her around. And they vote out Lance over her, despite the majority of the tribe openly talking about how much they love Lance. While Jane does get hate here and there. Again, like, there's a lot of talk about how Jane doesn't deserve to be there. But despite that, they do continue to keep on dragging her along until the final 6, and was supposed to be further if it had not been for Rob and Shona flipping the game to keep Joel around. Now, again, she was probably always going home at 5 unless she won immunity, and probably had a tough time ever winning the game. But I was surprised to see how locked in she was with the majority alliance, where she was, like, again, the clear 5th of that group. And again, considering how good of a relationship she had with Sophie, to have Sophie want to fight to keep her around, I feel like that was good enough for her being number 6. Again, like, at the end of the day, like, her and Naomi, I think, are pretty close. And I can definitely see the argument for Naomi being higher, but I did decide to land Jane here at number 6. Now, number 5. At number 5, I'm surprised this person's this high, because I came into this list thinking this person was going to be the bottom of the people that made the merge. But I was pleasantly surprised by a couple things on the rewatch. Again, purely as a game player, not as a person at all. At number 5, I do have Joel. Now, again, real life, I'm obviously not complimentary of Joel as a person. But again, purely talking about his game, it's bad. Like, it's not great. Again, like, up to this point, I don't think anyone has played particularly well, really. For me, the top 4 on this list are the definitive top 4. But I was surprised at Joel's agency at the final 6. Again, like, Joel plays pretty poorly for the majority of the game and clearly, like, loses his mind while out there and rubs people the wrong way. Again, he needs the final 7 immunity to stay in the game. Really, before that, he's kind of just riding the wave of being the physical guy on the tribe. Again, they only go to tribal once in the pre-merge where Jeff gets taken out. Again, it was never really going to be Joel just because he was, again, one of the more physical people. And then the first 3 rounds after merge, it was a straight pagonging. But Joel was the first boot from that group had he not won immunity. And he does win immunity. And then he was once again being targeted at final 6 until the Rob and Shona deal comes into play. Now, this is something that I did not actually remember, that I decided to give Joel some credit here for, and the fact that he's the one to create the deal. I remembered this as Rob being the one to create the deal to Joel, where, again, the deal is that they make a final 3, Rob, Shona, and Joel will throw final immunity. I thought that was Rob's deal. In retrospect, it's Joel's deal. Joel is the one that explicitly makes the deal. He gets all the credit on the show, and it's incredible gameplay. If he had been playing the game more actively, like, again, like, if he had been willing to flip on Rob and Shona in the endgame, this is incredible gameplay to keep him safe at the final 6. Like, to make them believe that he is going to actively throw final 3 immunity, it's insane. I think at the end of the day, I mean, like, I'll give Rob a lot more of the credit considering it works out in his favor. And it turns out that Joel wasn't lying. And to be honest, I think if you know Joel as a person, you know he's not lying. But again, if this was like any other normal person on a normal season of Survivor, this is insane that he pulls this off. So I did want to give him some credit for that, which is why he's as high as he is here. Again, beyond that, he becomes a swing vote the next vote, doesn't flip, clearly stays true to his word beyond that. Again, he could have made some pretty big moves in the end game that could have benefited him, put him in a good position to win out at the end. He doesn't do it. And then he throws the final immunity challenge anyway to Rob in a position where, again, like if he didn't throw it, he could have won that. Again, it was this dumb competition of largely just luck. But again, like if Joel won that final immunity, he could have taken Shona to the end and possibly would have won a jury vote. Now, do I think he does? Probably not. If I were to guess, I don't think Joel can win the game in the jury vote against any of the people he was there against at the end. I think if it's him or Jane, I think he can win there. Against any of the other four, I feel like it is a tough road, but he definitely could have bettered his odds of getting to the end and like was literally right there anyway, but he doesn't do it. So again, overall bad game, but the final 6 move I think is impressive on paper, and that is enough for him to land here at number 5. Now number 4, we're moving on to a player that I thought this player was going to be number 2 coming into this list. I was so solid on this person being the number 2 player on this cast until my rewatch, and I definitely went down a bit, even though I do think they're probably one of the better strategic thinkers on the cast, and that person is Katie. Now, Katie, I think, deserves a lot of the credit for putting together the majority alliance. I mean, she is the one that forms this majority alliance of her, Rob, Shona, and Sophie. Like, we explicitly see her going to each of the individual members and bringing them together, and I think that deserves credit. However, I do think she also played a very faulty game even within that. I mean, she doesn't get her way on the Jeff vote where she tries to keep him around, tries to vote out Jane. It doesn't work. She fails there. She does do a lot of good work post-merge where Craig is throwing her under the bus continuously, but she's able to counter that pretty well, gets Joel back on her side. I think that's all pretty good work. She obviously does get flipped on by Rob at the final 6, where, again, like Rob just strictly outplays her, and she does get very emotional from that. And I do think that is one of the more annoying things about Katie in general is just her hypocrisy throughout a lot of the end game. But despite that, I do think she plays the next round decently well, where she tries to flip over Joel, has Sophie on her side, but I think she plays pretty optimally there. But then we get to the final 4 round where it's just a complete disaster. I mean, it really is. Like, everything she does there is so wrong. And again, it was never going to work anyway. Again, like, she was in such a bad spot that after the Jane boot, her game was pretty much sealed at that point. But her final 4 round is so messy where she's literally going to every single person and telling them a different story and trying to get them on her side. She tries to flip Joel against Shona, goes to Shona, tries to flip her against Joel to where Shona tells her that she's not flipping, and she gets upset at Shona, only for Joel to show up, and then only for them to get in a massive argument and exposing her, essentially. And again, that's all really sloppy gameplay, but like, again, at the end of the day, it was never going to be effective anyway. And really, like, Katie probably fails at a lot more of the things that she tries to do throughout the season than she succeeds. But, I mean, again, like, I think there is some potential there. She is clearly a very strategic player. She's good in challenges. She's okay socially. I mean, she's definitely not the best socially, and that's probably why she's as low as she is, because I do think the top 3 are better social players than her. I think Katie is the least likely to win a jury vote of these top 4 players, and these top 4 players are the people that she planned on going to 4 with. So I think that's also a knock, but there's enough there for me that is positive about Katie to land her at 4, despite the number of flaws that she has. Now, number 3, we're moving on to someone that went up in my estimations after my rewatch, where this is a person that I completely forgot about, if I'm being honest. Like, I really forgot that this person played as well as they did. And at number 3, we do have Sophie, the 5th placer on this season. And again, like, I think Sophie is actually a pretty good Survivor player. Like, I actually considered putting her at number 2 for a while. And like, I think she's someone that if it wasn't going to be Rob winning the season, I feel like Sophie's definitely the most likely other winner. Where again, we see her being very good socially to where she is put into this majority alliance that forms very early on between Rob, Shona, Sophie, and Katie. We see her also really bond with Jane, and Sophie ends up doing a lot of work to keep Jane in the game. Like at the Jeff vote, we see her try to pull her along. At the Lance vote, we see her do the same thing. Like, she does seem to do a lot of good work there. She makes the final 2 with Rob, which is not a great situation, where I think Rob's like one of the few people she could lose against, but still, I mean, again, it's Australian Survivor 2002 we're talking about. And she does get outplayed, obviously, at the final 6 round, But I do think she gets also like kind of unlucky in the sense that Katie wins immunity at the final 5, where I think if Katie doesn't win immunity at final 5, I think there's definitely a chance Sophie survives that round. And I mean, then she'll be only 2 immunities away from winning. Or again, I do think she beats both Shona and Joel at the end. Now again, like in the grand scheme of Survivor, like she's definitely flawed. Like obviously, like going to the end with Rob is just a massive mistake, especially when it seems clear from the offset that Rob is also very close to the other 2 people in your alliance. Rob's final 2 with Sophie is literally the last one he ends up making. So I do think that's a pretty bad read from Sophie's end to think that he's loyal to that one in particular, but still, I think Sophie seemed to have a lot of social capital within the game and did use a lot of that to keep Jane around. And I think if she had been a slightly more savvy player, she definitely could have positioned herself in a way that she could have easily won the game through taking Jane even further in the game. But again, she gets outplayed by Rob, and even if she didn't do that, she would have probably taken herself to a situation where she probably loses. So that's the biggest faults against her game. But I think in most other elements of the game, I think she is pretty good. So at the end of the day, I do have her here at number 3. Now, at number 2, we actually have the runner-up of the season, who, again, I really struggled with where to place them, but at number 2, we do have Shona. Now, again, there was a point where I had Shona at 4, there was a point where I had her at 3, but I did end up going with 2 here. Now, I think the biggest problem for Shona is the same problem that everyone else on the cast had, and that's that they wanted to go to the end with Rob. The major difference here is that Shona was at least right that Rob wanted to take her to the end, while Katie and Sophie were obviously clearly wrong. Again, the problem is that she doesn't win against Rob, and I do think she struggles to win against like a Sophie as well, but I think outside of that, like she probably wins against Katie. If not, it's very close. I think she definitely wins against Joel, definitely wins against Jane. Like I think she definitely is still a potential winner towards the end game of this season. And she is a strategic thinker. Like I do think she is a strategic player. I do think some of that gets clouded by emotion at points, particularly in the round where Craig goes home, where she wants to save Craig, where I don't think that's the optimal move for her, especially for her to be wasting so much social capital and trying to do so. But again, she's active enough in the game to where she does actually try to make a flip there. We do see her strategizing with Rob quite a bit. And while Rob is usually the more sound strategic mind during those debates, and you can clearly tell Shona is thinking about the game strategically. I mean, she is approving of the Joel deal, which again, I think she's probably the least integral to out of the 3 people involved in it. But still, I mean, like she still is willing to go along with that deal, which I think there are other people on this season that if they heard about this deal, they would just turn it away because that's Australian Survivor 2002 for you. I just wish there was a little bit more agency there in her, like trying to get into a final 2 scenario that she could actually win. Again, she did very effective work in getting to the final 2 scenario that she did, which was her overall goal, but it's just that her goal was very misguided if she wanted to win the game. But again, like I still think she had chances to win the game. She had a good relationship with Craig. I would consider a positive in her game as well. And she is an overall okay strategic thinker. So because of that, I did land her here at number 2. And at number 1, it's obviously Rob. I mean, Rob is number 1 this season by a lot. And to be honest, I think Rob is still probably one of the best players in the history of the show. But I mean, like, especially from this like older school era of Survivor, like up to this point in Survivor, which again, this aired at the same time as Survivor Marquesas. I think Rob Dixon here is the best player in the history of the show across all versions of it. Like, I think he is that impressive of a player where, I mean, he is essentially a proto Tom Westman, but an even better version of Tom Westman in my eyes, where Tom Westman was this like family man, leader of their tribe, domineering figure on his cast, but was someone that like had no one that was going to take him to the end and had to win out. Rob Dixon does one better in the sense that Rob Dixon had everyone taking him to the end, despite still being in a similar archetype to a Tom Westman. Now again, that could be indicative of the players that were on this cast, where again, like Rob, I think was one of the few players that was willing to play the game as hard as he needed to. But again, that's something we rarely see from this era of Survivor. I mean, he does get on his high horse at points, and I do think he lucks out at certain points in the game, but I mean, like everyone does. And again, when comparing him to the rest of the field from the season, he's still far and away number 1. And again, he is on the dominant tribe early on, only goes to one tribal and becomes a swing vote at that tribal. Gets into the merge where he does become targeted by Craig, but eventually is able to get Craig out. Gets to the final 7 where he's still a massive swing vote and in the majority alliance that had been running the game up until that point. Flips on that majority alliance at final 6 to make a deal with Joel, where Joel agrees to throw final immunity to him. Now, I don't think Rob handles Sophie and Katie in the best possible way afterwards, where I do think it is somewhat poor jury management the way he handles Katie in particular, but he does still effectively get them out back to back, getting to the final 3 scenario where Joel does actually throw final immunity to him, giving him the win, where he beats Shona pretty handily. Where despite people like Jane and Sophie having reason to dislike him, they still end up voting for him to win. He doesn't get Craig's vote, who obviously was very close to Shona, but also doesn't get Katie's vote, which was an anti-Rob vote. But still, he effectively wins the jury vote here in pretty dominant fashion. I mean, he pretty much controlled the entire game, had a majority alliance that ran the entire game with literally every single person in that majority alliance wanting to take him to the final 2, which is insane. And realistically, the final 6 move to take Joel to 3, like, to be honest, even though it is a big move, like, it's not even a necessary move. Again, like, everyone takes him to the end even without that, but that move more so guarantees that he gets to the end in his ideal situation, which is against Shona. Again, it makes him burn Sophie and Katie along the way, which is not ideal. And because I can see the argument for this not being the best move for his game. But again, the fact that he's willing to turn on alliances like he does on the season is a pretty big pro for me in terms of my assessment as a player. And again, with how dominant his winning game here was, I think there's no other place to put him here than number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for Australian Survivor 2002. I know everyone's been waiting for this list for so long, obviously. But yeah, I mean, obviously I'll do similar videos to this for every other Survivor or Big Brother season that I do a retrospective of down the road. So stay tuned for those and the normal content you can expect from the channel. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.